Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Depot Dive. I'm Ross McCorkle, that's Joe Clark, and we're going to dive into three of the biggest Steelers-related topics of the week. Training camp week 2 is underway, which means the pads are on. The real football is now happening. We can actually start to evaluate some of what we're seeing on the field. It's not just the underwear Olympics anymore, and we have a ton to talk about today. Of course, Max Iheanachor standing out, unfortunately getting injured. We'll talk about that at the top of the show. Then we're going to do a grab bag of just random training camp topics. There's a ton of little things to talk about, so we'll kind of hop all over the roster and discuss those. And finally, we'll wrap things up with the initial depth chart being released, albeit you probably don't want to take this one too seriously, but we'll still discuss it a little bit. And finally, wrap the show up with a listener question if you want to have a question answered. 412-254-3145. Joe, how are you doing?
Doing well. How about you?
I'm hanging in there. We're, I guess almost halfway through training camp, which is crazy. I feel like we've been in it for like a month, but I also feel like it just started. So the fact that Saturday will be the old Friday Night Lights. It'll now be Saturday Night Lights. And then kind of once Saturday Night Lights happens, then you're into the game week kind of thing where they're doing preseason games. This time next week, we'll have our first Steelers football preseason game of the year. And then everything starts to happen pretty quick. I think training camp wraps up then officially, like the public practices. When does that wrap up? That's
A week from Monday. So after Saturday, there's only 5 practices left. It'll be Monday, Tuesday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
And, just today was the first full actual training camp practice where they weren't in the quote-unquote ramp-up period. There's kind of different phases to that. First, it's no pads. Then they have the pads on, but they aren't able to do the full practice. Now they're able to do a full-length practice. Mike McCarthy called this the first actual, or I forget exactly how he phrased it, but he referred to this as like the first real training camp practice. And so you're already pretty much halfway into training camp by the time you start to get to the real stuff, if that tells you anything about the state of today's training camp and practice availability in today's CBA and player-friendly league. So anyway, we'll dive in and talk about Max Iheanachor because I think that's the biggest news and the most immediate news, the freshest news. This just happened at practice earlier today, and I guess we'll start with the injury just because that's the big immediate news. And we don't know exactly what happened to him, but I think it was like 45 minutes into practice, so probably like individual drills or whatever. It wasn't like deep enough into practice to really get into 11 on 11, I don't think. He was seen getting looked at by trainers and kind of rotating his arms, and our Alex Kozora said he was grimacing, so a little bit of pain involved, maybe a shoulder, maybe a neck, some kind of upper body ailment. Joe, not great news. And the Steelers have had kind of poor luck with the first rounders recently. I mean, going back to Troy Fautanu had that injury rookie year. I think he was dealing with some stuff during training camp in the preseason. And then, of course, he had the actual injury once the season began that held him out for a while there. So, and then, of course, last year, Derek Harmon had a similar issue. What was it, the first preseason game? He injured his knee and tried to I can't remember the exact timelines, but basically the first round picks have had poor injury luck lately, and that's a shame.
Yeah, especially because Iheanachor had reportedly been playing pretty well at camp, holding his own, and going down today. Obviously, left the practice field, which usually a sign that it's a little more serious. I mean, we'll probably get an update from Mike McCarthy tomorrow, but wouldn't be surprised if Iheanachor was not practicing tomorrow. Seemed to be, like you said, like a shoulder, upper arm sort of thing. So we'll see. Could be a variety of issues there. But hopefully it's not too serious because the Steelers, it sounded like Iheanachor was maybe pushing for a starting role. Mike McCarthy kind of talked about the importance of having a starting 5 offensive line that you kind of roll with, not mixing and matching as many players. So if you wanted to get Iheanachor reps and he had been playing well, it seemed like he was maybe pushing for that right tackle job. So this is definitely a return to that. We'll see how much time he misses, what the severity of the injury is. But yeah, just bad luck for the Steelers.
Yeah, and it's kind of just the perspective of this all is if this would have happened a week ago, and say, I mean, we don't know anything about the severity of the injury, but say this requires him to start the season on IR. We don't know that. That may well not happen. But say it does. A week ago, we probably wouldn't have. I mean, it would have been like, oh, that's a bummer. But we weren't necessarily thinking of him as the starting candidate. And you do have Broderick Jones back in the equation. You have Dylan Cook. The depth at tackle is good. And so that all that is still true. They still have that depth. And, thankfully that's the case because this is exactly why you want to have that kind of depth. Very few teams do have this kind of depth at tackle. But now it feels almost worse because of how well he was performing. And it's just such a kick in the gut. Yeah, I mean, we just heard yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, all the days kind of blend together, but we were just hearing from some of the local beat writers that he's already looking better than Broderick Jones ever did in a Steelers uniform. And some of the stuff being tossed around, comparing him to like Marquise Pouncey and David DeCastro, who both kind of hit the ground running, and you immediately knew in their rookie training camp, all right, these guys are going to be day one starters. He was kind of on that track, and maybe he can get back on it, but certainly this throws a wrench into things. I mean, how much time would he have to, when would he have to come back to really have a shot at winning this job? I mean,
I I think it would have to be, at some point early next week to be able to play in the preseason game on Thursday. I think if he misses the preseason game, that's a valuable, game reps, game experience that he's potentially going to miss if he doesn't play. And at that point, I think it's just tough to give him the starting job because, you have two other players in Broderick Jones and Dylan Cook who are at least a little bit more proven. Dylan Cook, really only came on towards the end of last season, but, it'll be tough to give a rookie now who would be losing reps, would be losing game reps, the starting job there. So I do think he would have to come back, in time to play against the Packers. Because if he does that and you get, three solid preseason showings out of him, I think you're a lot more comfortable. But outside of that, I just think it's going to be difficult to, make him the week one starter if he's not playing immediately. I mean, we saw with Fautanu, he got hurt. I think it was the first preseason game. Kind of worked his way back, but then it wasn't until I guess it was week two when he kind of really rotated with Broderick Jones. So I guess it was earlier in the season. Because that was the game where Broderick Jones had three penalties on one drive, and then
right.
Fautano basically took over, got hurt in practice later that week, and that ended his season. So, I mean, different under Mike McCarthy. We'll see if he wants to bring a Hunter in that early, but I do think that he'd probably have to get back next week if he's going to start week one.
It's just been so long since the Steelers have had a rookie that not only looked good this early, but then also went on to have a really good rookie season. Like, when was the last like super standout rookie season that the Steelers have had? I mean,
It's
gosh,
been a while.
it's
And
hard to even answer that.
On offense, Chase Claypool.
Man, but that's a while back now.
Yeah.
Yeah, there really haven't been that many. Then I'm sure maybe I'm missing one in my head here, but really, and I'm not just talking first round picks. Really, any rookie they haven't really had like these hot starts that you see other teams enjoy around the league. I mean, look last year at the Seahawks, Nick Manwari, and some of these guys were pretty immediate contributors and were a big part of the reason why they had the season they did and won the Super Bowl there in Seattle. It's been a while since the Steelers have had somebody like that. I just really hope if Max Iheanachor was on that trajectory, I really hope that something didn't just throw a wrench in the plan there. But I guess the silver lining is, and probably what we should be focusing on right now, is the fact that he has looked really good. I think, a lot was made about certain comparisons that were made, and I guess, point the finger at myself here because I'm the one who did his scouting report, and I did kind of compare him to Broderick Jones. I will say those pro comparisons are never perfect, and I think I, said that at the time. But I saw similar issues on tape in the way that, sometimes his hands would get a little too wide and he'd give up his chest and maybe his latch wasn't the greatest and just struggling to put it all together on a rep in, rep out basis. But man, if there's one thing you could say about Iheanachor and his quick rise from not playing football to being a first round pick in what was it, like 4 years or whatever it was, he's a quick learner. And so I don't think we should be all that surprised to see him already looking good after, a few months now of NFL instruction and James Campen and some pretty veteran coaches at that. So I'm really encouraged by his early performance.
Yeah, it's definitely a positive. And you look, I mean, James Campen's developed a ton of starting quality, really talented offensive lineman, even, outside of the first round. Now handing him a first round guy who, like you said, is a quick learner, has all the physical tools in the world to be a successful offensive tackle. It's definitely exciting.
And I will point out that I've always kind of been on the man, it would be nice to get Broderick Jones on the field train just because, well, I mean, at the end of the day, he was a first round pick, and it would really suck if he just left in free agency on like a 1 year, $5 million prove it kind of deal, and may or may not even get the Steelers like a seventh round compensatory pick. That is just an absolute worst case when you not only draft the guy in the first round, but trade up to draft the guy in the first round. And if you can't even get a comp pick back for him at a premium position at that, a position where you really, I mean, we just saw it with Dan Moore Jr., you could really get good comp value back for players at this position. To not even be able to get that would be a shame. And so there's a silver lining potentially. And again, we don't know. Maybe Iheanachor will be back out there tomorrow. Maybe it was just a little pinched nerve stinger kind of thing or a bruise. Fingers crossed on that. There's been a kind of a narrative out there that him handling guys like TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith, and he certainly has been handling them well, stalemating or even just flat out beating them in some of these one-on-one reps. The Steelers brought him in basically because of that. They loved what they saw at the Senior Bowl in the one-on-one reps. It's already translated to the NFL, so that's very encouraging. But there has been a narrative that, wait, what does that say about Watt and Highsmith if they're already getting beat by the rookie? Joe, any thoughts on that?
I don't think there's anything to be concerned about. I mean, training camp's the time for guys to go out and high school, to experiment with new moves, just try to put into practice. I'm not worried about it. I mean, I think game reps are very different than just one-on-one reps. Um, I would not be concerned at all. I mean, I think it's a good sign for Iheanachor, but I don't think it's a bad sign for Watt or Highsmith whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think Watt has been working on. I mean, I think he said it on McAfee or something that he finds it ridiculous when people are saying, "Oh, such and such player had a good practice, such and such player had a bad practice." He said, "You never know what the coaches are trying to have him work on, or what the players might be working on themselves." And I think Watt has been around enough first round tackles now to where he probably helps them along and kind of coaches them from the field. I think he's even said as much in the past about working with guys like Fautanu, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's kind of doing similar stuff with Iheanachor. But no matter which way you cut it, Iheanachor, it's still good on him to be winning all those reps against standout players like that. If he can block Watt and Highsmith, and I think maybe Herbig's gotten the better of him once or twice. My understanding is he's lost very few reps. Obviously, we're not there, but it's encouraging no matter which way you cut it. So I think we've said enough on Iheanachor. I'm sure we'll either get an insider report about his injury status, or maybe Mike McCarthy will give us at least some information in the morning, although he kind of seems like a guy who's not really going to delve into injury stuff that much. I think he even said as much. He said, especially during camp, ask the players basically. And of course, players don't talk to the media usually when they're injured. So basically, we may not get information unless some kind of insider reports there. Moving on to other training camp topics here. Joe, well, I guess I'll give you your pick of the litter here. There's a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, just to go off, what's most current. Brennan Eccles got banged up today in practice. Had ice around his ankle and was sitting down. Steelers are getting pretty thin at nickel. You have Dante Kent's on pup, Jalen Ramsey's on pup, and now Eccles going down. So that is an area that's getting a little bit thin. Something to monitor. We'll see the severity of that injury. Another thing I find interesting is the team signed two safeties. They signed Rayshon Jenkins and Israel. I'm probably going to butcher his last name. Mukuamu, who was with Mike McCarthy in Dallas. I think he's the guy that provides special teams versatility too and depth there. And Mike McCarthy kind of said, maybe the safety position, they need guys that can contribute on special teams. So interesting to see him get signed. You still have Robert Spears Jennings in the fold. He's been playing a lot. I think it's a good sign for chances to make the roster, but I think interesting that they're bringing in depth and safety, and McCarthy kind of pinpointed that to being an area, especially with a report before camp. I think it was by Mike DeFabo saying that safety was a position that the Steelers might look to add. So interesting that early on they've already added two guys there.
Yeah, and let's pause there in the secondary. Like you said, they added two guys, and I mean that Mukuamu 5-unit special teamer, and he has, I think he's 6'4" or something like that, so unique body type that they have in him. He played kind of all over the secondary in Dallas. He played, slot, wide corner, free safety, box safety. So he's another one of those just kind of mix and match sort of defensive backs. Now, I don't know if I would call his roster chances great, but this is definitely a guy you could see them keeping around on the practice squad and calling up for special teams reasons, or maybe they've got an injury in the secondary and they need an extra body there, kind of depth purposes. This is definitely a guy who could stick around and probably, honestly, right now, if I had to say, I think he will probably end up on the practice squad, just given his connection to McCarthy and what he can offer the team in a variety of different roles. So interesting signings there. Yeah, right now, what I think Danico Slaughter is the kind of starting slot with with all these guys out. Ramsey, I guess, has been doing a little bit more on the side. Is that the understanding with him?
Yeah, he did. I think he got some rehab in before practice today, and then came out to the field. He's been working a little bit with Joey Porter Jr. Dante Kent's been doing a lot more. I think he had an ACL at the end of last year, so he's getting back from that. So it sounds like those three guys are pretty close. I mean, the joke with Joey Porter Jr. is he'll be back once the contract gets signed. We'll see. I think he could even come back before that, depending on how negotiations go. But all three of them seem to be getting, relatively close.
Yeah, I would really like to see Kent back in the fold. I don't know what his path is. I'm probably more of a practice squad guy as well at this point, but I always just go back to the stuff Omar Khan said about him. And, Omar Khan's not he kind of has Andy Weidel and the personnel staff to do the heavy lifting with actual evaluation. Not to say Khan can't and doesn't, but Khan specifically spoke about how much tape he watched on Kent before last draft in 2025, and that kind of raises eyebrows when it's kind of his guy, his late round gem that he was hoping to work out. And I would like to see if Khan's evaluation was correct there. He certainly has interesting tools and can contribute on special teams and all that. So where else do we want to go? I think Yahya Black is grabbing some headlines for multiple reasons: his play on the field, but also just his body. Man, this guy came into the league at, let me see, I had it pulled up here. I think Yahya Black, 6'0", 5'6", 336 pounds, 35-inch arms, already just a massive human being. I think Mike Tomlin called him a big chassis, which is certainly true. Honestly, right now he makes that 336-pound version of himself look small. If you ask me, I don't know how much weight he's gained. It's kind of hard to gauge from afar, but some of those pictures where he's got his shirt rolled up and his belly's out, and he's got the kind of short football pants on, so his thighs are out. I mean, this dude just looks enormous. I don't think Calvin Austin III left in free agency. I think Yahya Black might have just eaten him. That's how big this guy looks. And I don't know. What do you think about this? I've seen mixed reactions. Already was kind of big and tall, and you worry about the knee bend. Are you worried about him adding weight? Is it appropriate now that he's kind of nose tackle one? What do you think?
I think him playing nose tackle, it makes a lot of sense because we saw last season when he played the middle, there's times he was just kind of getting blown off the ball. And some of it was, him being too upright, but a lot of it was just, he double teams. He didn't really have the functional strength to handle them. And I think, if you're adding weight, you're probably adding some strength to go with that. I think just him being bigger in general is going to make him more of a plugger up the middle and make him harder to kind of get blown off the ball like he did a couple of times last year. I mean, he got some praise from Cam Hayward. He's gotten some praise, from the coaching staff. I think it's all positive. I mean, I don't think he'd be adding weight if it wasn't something that was, kind of directed towards him to be like, hey, get a little bit bigger, get a little bit stronger. Maybe he could afford to cut down a few pounds with the new weight fines. Who knows what they want him at? But I definitely think that it's not a worry in terms of, oh, he's out of shape, given that what they've said about him, he seems to be playing well in practice, giving Zach Frazier really all he can handle at center, and Zach Frazier is one of the best centers in the league. So it doesn't seem to be affecting his game from what we've heard at camp. So, I mean, I think right now it's certainly a positive.
Yeah, I think last year, it was the preseason when Yahya Black hype is probably the right word, reached a all-time high. You had guys like Baldinger just constantly breaking down his tape and those Baldy's breakdowns, and just, he did look really good in the preseason. If we went back to some of our episodes last year, we were certainly talking about the potential with Yahya Black. I don't know that I anticipated him ever getting bigger. I thought he'd maybe move the other direction, and because they kind of viewed him as like more of a 4-eye who could slide inside. I I get why they moved him inside to nose tackle. He is the biggest human on the roster. And, you know, I think back to when the Steelers had, he's kind of approaching Daniel McCullers territory. Throwback to those of you that remember him. I think drafted, 2014. He was 6'7", 352 pounds, which at the time was just like crazy, almost unheard of. And I mean, Yahya Black is basically in that same territory, maybe like an inch and some change shorter, but probably about the same weight. McCullers never quite panned out. I think he, leverage and all that, but I don't want to say that that's automatically disqualifying for somebody like Black, but it does worry me a little bit just when you're already that tall, you add that kind of weight. Knee bend's already an issue. I don't think adding weight makes knee bend any easier. I think if anything, it might make it a little harder, a little extra pressure on those knees. Man, I can't imagine. My knees already kind of hurt when I bend down. I can't imagine carrying 350 and trying to do that. And then you look at somebody like Jordan Davis on the Eagles. I think his height weight was kind of in that same ballpark coming into the league. He's shed weight since then. He's much thinner now. But, he was a first-round pick. I don't want to necessarily compare them one-to-one, but just to say the body type does work playing them, in the inside like that. And, the fact that he's already giving Zach Frazier all he can handle, I mean, I think he's going to be totally fine. I'm excited for what that can bring. I'm glad that Keanu Benton's, kind of not in that role anymore. We'll talk about him on the depth chart a little bit later, but playing defensive end now, and I think that's a good spot for him. The quarterback battle, pretty much nothing's changed since last time we talked. Mason Rudolph still QB2, and, Howard and Aller kind of, everybody's getting tons of reps because of the way Mike McCarthy runs practice. Now, I don't know if it was just because of the questions that were asked or what. I didn't actually listen to the full press conference this morning, but Mike McCarthy specifically mentioned Mason Rudolph and Drew Aller. I don't think there was much going on with Howard there. What did he say about those guys, and what do you read into it, Joe?
Yeah, so Mason Rudolph, he said Mason Rudolph looks like he's better than expected. Drew Aller, I think he said he makes a throw every day or something like that. That is he getting better every day, makes a throw every day. That's and makes him look like an NFL caliber type quarterback. I think the Mason Rudolph one kind of stands out to me more because you look at what he said about Howard. Obviously, Aller's going to be on the roster. Mason Rudolph one kind of leads me to believe that he likes what he's seeing from Mason Rudolph. It gets me more on the potentially you keep four quarterback train. I think Aller made some nice throws today too, and it just seems like he is taking steps every day. McCarthy had said earlier this week too that he's taking instruction really well from Aaron Rodgers and that he's really enjoying watching Rodgers work the young quarterbacks. He said there's an adjustment he made to Aller's footwork and I think his communication that Aller took and immediately put into practice that I think worked out pretty well. So I mean, I think everything's a positive. I think with Will Howard, you're not getting, the big throws that Drew Aller's making. Drew Aller has more of the physical traits that you look for, but I think Will Howard has been, pretty consistent so far. I don't think there's been anything he's shown that would make you worry about him. But, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because it will be tough to keep four quarterbacks, especially when you look, they're adding depth at safety. They seem like they want to, keep a special teams guy and when you keep four quarterbacks, the last spot that you would lose would be somebody that would be a special teamer. I'm intrigued how it's going to play out, but I was definitely intrigued that he offered Mason Rudolph a little bit of praise today because it's been kind of quiet on the Mason Rudolph front. You hear it and now and again somebody will say something positive about him, but for McCarthy to come out and speak positively about him does lead you to believe that he maybe has a better shot at making this roster than I might have thought even a week ago.
Yeah, quote, I can't tell you how pleased I am with him, talking about Mason Rudolph. Quarterbacks play a while in this league, so the experience that he's gained, I think, is incredibly valuable to us. The footwork's different, so now that anytime you ask an experienced player to change footwork or things like that and his fundamentals, he's doing a really nice job. The throws are better than I knew, just that I think like anything in the quarterback, you really don't know until you stand next to him or you're out there on the field. That's really how each guy throws the ball. I don't know. Mike McCarthy sometimes lets the yinzer fly and the quotes get a little messy there. But I think you get the point. They're impressed with Rudolph, and I agree. I think at this point, it's man, is it starting to look like four quarterbacks or just Howard off the roster? Is that the two paths? I have a hard time seeing Rudolph not making the roster at this point. I guess the preseason games could obviously change opinion there, but is that how you're seeing it, or are you leaning more that way now?
That's the way I am leaning more, but it's just so tough to see Howard off the roster because as we've talked about before with McCarthy saying that Will Howard looks like a starting quarterback in the NFL. Is that a guy you're just going to release ahead of his second season? I don't know. I don't. It's going to be very, very interesting. But yeah, I mean, my opinion has certainly changed. I was of the belief that Howard would make it over Rudolph, but I'm starting to lean towards Rudolph having the edge as the veteran.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there'll be trade ideas thrown around as the preseason goes on, especially if Howard looks good, or maybe Howard and Rudolph both look good. I'm sure there's gonna be all kinds of trade speculation and all that. I still kind of think that Rudolph. I mean, I don't know. I still kind of think he could potentially be stashed on the practice squad. I don't know if anybody would necessarily go after him, but I guess quarterbacks are needed in the league. Maybe they would. People weren't exactly. He wasn't a hot commodity, this past or two off seasons ago when he, left the Titans and came back to the Steelers. It wasn't that hot of a market for him. So I still wonder if you could get him onto the practice squad. And I guess still, an injury or kind of a fake injury, if you will, could land one of these guys on IR like Drew Aller. But those guys on IR still have to get carried on the initial 53, and so you still have to expose somebody, or you're still having to do some tough roster math to make that happen in the first place. So I'm sure that'll all be talked about plenty going forward. Caleb Johnson back on the kick return unit, Joe.
Yeah, I'm good for him getting another opportunity to kind of, right his wrong, I guess, from last year. He wasn't great when he had, opportunities to begin last season on the return unit before the, big mistake against the Seahawks, but I'm glad he's getting a chance at redemption. I mean, having as many guys as possible to return kickoffs with the new kickoff rule is a good thing. If it's a chance for him to, maybe be the second kick returner on the roster. I mean, Eli Hadenreich maybe was looking out of that role, but he missed practice today with an injury. Any Caleb Johnson doing anything special teams wise and having even moderate success is huge for his standing on the roster. And I'm glad he's getting the opportunities because I do think that there still might be something in the tank there. I mean, I was high on him coming out of the draft. I loved his tape at Iowa, so maybe I'm just still holding on to that hope that he can become something. But I just have a feeling that there's more to come from Caleb Johnson in the NFL, and I would hope that it's with the Steelers. So I'm excited to see him getting the reps on special teams.
Yeah, also playing right wing on the punt coverage unit. So I wrote about this over the weekend. I think there's some good and some bad when you look at kind of his chances to make the 53-man roster. We said he need to contribute on special teams, and they seem to be trying to find him a role there, so that's good. On the downside, I think there's been times where Lou Nichols has seemingly been in front of him in some of the rotations. It's hard to read too much into that because they're just rotating guys constantly, and there's maybe no rhyme or reason to it. But still, the fact that Caleb Johnson at times was running scout team on the defense while Lou Nichols was getting reps on offense does make you wonder. So I'm sure Caleb Johnson will be another hot topic throughout the rest of camp. I think we talked enough about Roman Wilson last week, but he's still continuing to have a pretty strong camp. And that actually segues us to the depth chart because Roman Wilson was officially listed as a starter. I think he's well ahead of Jeremy Bernard at the moment. Now, they listed 3 wide receivers on the depth chart. That's a reflection of Mike McCarthy's 11 personnel heavy offense. You're, of course, going to have basically 3 receivers acting as starters rather than, in the past they had, multiple tight ends listed as starters and whatnot. So Roman Wilson, Michael Pittman Jr., DK Metcalf. I don't know if it really matters, but when they list the first wide receiver slot, it was DK. The second wide receiver slot was Roman, and the third was Michael Pittman. I thought that was sort of interesting, but I don't know if that's just like left to right and Wilson kind of being in the middle there is more of a slot thing. I don't know. But Joe, what are some of the other observations from the depth chart?
Yeah, the big one that we talked about earlier is Yahya Black starting nose tackle. You have Keanu Benton is a backup at defensive tackle behind Cameron Hayward with Derek Harmon starting at defensive end. One other one I found a little bit interesting was Jalen Ramsey listed as your starting nickel. We haven't, seen Jalen Ramsey to see how they want to use him, but coming out of OTAs, the general idea we were getting from the reports coming out was that he would be probably used more in nickel than at safety. Deshaun Elliott and Jaquan Brisker listed as the starting safeties of the Ramsey and nickel. So I thought that was one that was pretty interesting. I also found it, a little bit noteworthy that you had, Caleb Johnson RB3, Lou Nichols 4, Travis Homer 5. Um, a little Homer's been playing a big role in special teams, so we'll see how that all shakes itself out. Malik Harrison listed behind Carson Bruner in the inside linebacker rotation. Thought that was a little bit interesting. Granted, this right outside linebacker, left inside linebacker. Harrison was listed at right, Bruner at left. And Mike McCarthy did say not to put too much value into the depth chart, but just some early things that are I think a little bit noteworthy that would catch your eye. I think that those are the ones that have kind of stood out. Dylan Cook, currently penciled in as your starting right tackle. Don't think that's really a big surprise. The other one, I think, and it can obviously change, is you have Ron McCollum as your backup center, Brock Hoffman as your backup guard. I think when push comes to shove, Hoffman probably has the inside track to play the backup center job because he has the versatility. But listed at guard right now, that's where he's been playing at camp. So again, not really all that surprising, but just something to note.
Yeah, Carson Bruner, we've talked about him and how he could maybe have a bigger role on defense. I'm excited to see him listed as kind of the one of the two primary backups. I guess he's behind Patrick Queen on there, and then you have Holcomb behind Peyton Wilson on there. So I think we've seen a lot of Holcomb rotating him in base defense. I think there was a report kind of early in camp saying he'd kind of leapt Peyton Wilson in terms of the base defense. I'm not sure how that's all played out exactly. We'll see more of that once the preseason games begin. But we failed to mention this, Joe. What do you think about Aaron Rodgers maybe playing in the preseason? 40 snaps?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I mean, I saw a theory floated the other day that, you have a easier schedule early in the season where it gets more difficult late. So you want to get, Rodgers ready to go. The last time he played in the preseason significantly was 2018, which is the last year under Mike McCarthy. I mean, I really didn't think he was going to play at all because you want to see as much Will Howard and Drew Aller as possible to kind of really determine, the Howard versus Rudolph battle and Aller, how he looks as a developmental quarterback. But yeah, I thought I was surprised reading that. But you think about it some more. It is not necessarily new to him, but it is a new year over year scheme. Just get him as comfortable as possible. I'm kind of a fan of it. I mean, you risk injury, obviously, that's the big concern. But I think Aaron Rodgers is going to be smart about it if he's playing in the preseason, and not put himself in that position. But yeah, that was definitely a little bit of a surprise.
Well, I think an overlooked storyline with that is if you're having Rodgers in there for 40 snaps, that means all of the other starters are going to be in there for 40 snaps. That's not just Rodgers. They're not putting Rodgers in there with no second team offensive line or second team receivers. They're definitely not doing that. And so you're going to get, at least it sounds like, a fair amount of snaps out of the entire starting offense, which, I am sort of in favor of. But yeah, then the question is, how the heck do you get these young quarterbacks enough snaps, and how do you make an educated decision on who's the backup and are you going to keep four and all that? So, I mean, 40 snaps, I think I did the math. There's 180 snaps or thereabouts last year in the 3 preseason games the Steelers had. So when you're talking about 40 snaps, that's, not quite a full game, but almost one full game of the preseason. Probably 3/4 worth of snaps you're getting for Aaron Rodgers. I just don't see that happening. I think maybe he's going to be closer to 20 or something like that. Yeah, he had 10 snaps with the Jets. I think the first year he was in New York, they gave him 10 preseason snaps. Other than that, he hasn't even played in the preseason, other than what you mentioned in 2018 when I think he had like 43 or 46 or something with McCarthy. And so, yeah, I mean, even then, how old would he have been in 2018? I mean, he would have been
8 years ago.
35 or whatever that is. Like almost 35, I guess, something like that. So, I mean, even at that age, McCarthy playing him 40 whatever snaps is, notable. So maybe he does mean it. I mean, maybe that is what's going to happen. Maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way, but certainly interesting. I I think I would play it by ear for sure, and it sounds like that's what Mike McCarthy wants to do. But play it by ear. If he gets in there and has two really crisp drives, and maybe you get him out there for a third, and even if it's a struggle, I think that's probably all that I need to see personally. But they probably obviously know better than I do. I think that's all for our topics today. We're going to move into our listener question. And again, if you want to have a question answered on a future episode, you can text or call this number 412-254-3145. That's also in the show notes if I spoke too fast. Just send us your name, where you're from, and a brief question that we can answer on a future episode. This one from a familiar voice, Brett in San Angelo, Texas.
Hello, Depot Dive. This is Brett from San Angelo, and we're in the predicting your roster season and training camp, and I just want to point out that in kind of some of the roster predictions, each of the last two seasons, Colbert never would seemingly put a guy on the disabled list. Kahn has seemingly kind of stashed at least one player on the injured list. 2 years ago, that was Logan Lee, who even he admitted after the season he wasn't really that hurt. Last year you saw that with Dante Kent. He had a major knee injury, but that was coming back off of the disabled list, not when he first went on it. So my question to you is kind of a twofold. One, who do you think, probably of the draft picks, ends up on the injured list with a wink, wink, nod, nod, maybe not that serious injury and probably is carried? And, predict which one. And if you agree that there probably will be one. All right, I'll set up and listen to the answer.
All right, so a question on who gets carried on IR. We spoke a little bit about this. I forget with who, but with the quarterbacks. That's the obvious one. That's the obvious answer to Brett's question there. But let's try to think outside the box. Some other guys who they might carry on IR, non-quarterback, to kind of stash them, if you will, a la Logan Lee a couple years ago, and they've done it with some others in the past. Any thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, I'll throw two rookie names. It'll really depend on how he plays in the preseason because we'll see how much demand there really is if they can pass him through waivers and get him on the practice squad. But Gabriel Rubio, I think, is one. The other could be Robert Spears Jennings if you're comfortable enough with one of the safeties you saw, like Grayshawn Jenkins or Mukuamu. And you have Sebastian Castro still in the fold as well. So I could see if they like Spears Jennings enough that he could potentially be one of those guys. But yeah, I think outside of the quarterbacks, Rubio and Spears Jennings are the two that kind of stick out to me as potential stash candidates.
I'll take a different route here. And honestly, Jennings Dunker sounds like a good option to me right now. And the reason being is, well, I guess it depends what happens with Stephen Jones. If Stephen Jones comes back soon, he's been sitting out of practice a little bit. Or I guess just today was his first practice out, right, Joe?
Yep.
Well, if he comes back sooner rather than later, he seemed to be running ahead of Dunker in the order there, which is fine. I think we all kind of realized that Dunker was going to need some time to figure out how to switch from tackle to guard, and maybe he needs a redshirt year anyways. And so if you have, the way I think about it, if you have Broderick Jones back in the equation like we do, many of us were not putting him in our 53-man roster predictions before camp started. He was kind of a surprise to come back and not be on PUP. And so, man, somebody has to get cut that you weren't expecting to get cut on the offensive line. And so, in my opinion, one of the offensive linemen would make sense to kind of sneak through on IR. And I think Dunker would really make sense because you have Spencer Anderson, you have Brock Hoffman, you potentially have Stephen Jones, a pretty good group there to fill in as backup interior guys. All right, I think that's it for today's show. I am Ross. That is Joe. Call the hotline for questions, and we'll catch you guys next time.